Today we have a special treat. We have two extraordinarily talented ladies from UnidosUS, and we are going to get a real treat as they explore what the impact of COVID on Latino students in K through 12. I'm going to leave it to them to tell you more about their organization and about their work and about this extraordinary report that they have done. That is how they came to our attention. It is a great read, and this report is online, and you can read it in depth, but today they're going to share with us some of the highlights and some of the recommendations as to how we make this better and not repeat the mistakes of the past. And I'm going to turn it over to our distinguished guests.
Thank you so much. All right, so hopefully everyone can hear us. Oh. No?
D-O-R.
Do we need to do anything with the mic?
Is your mic on?
Do we need to hit a button?
That's better.
MMC.
Butter? Can you hear me?
M.
Can you hear
No,
me? Or do we need
MMC,
to
double M.
push something?
Dot
All
edu.
right. Text.
Donald Alcindor.
That is correct.
All good?
You use that.
All
put it
right.
in the email.
Yeah, everyone can hear us?
Google
That
you.
better? Okay, awesome.
Great.
All right, well, we're going to introduce ourselves first so that you know who we are. We just want to thank everybody for sticking around. I know it's been a long day, a lot of speakers, and it's mid-afternoon, so hopefully you've had some coffee or caffeine.
Or chocolate.
Chocolate. But we're going to try to make this as painless and interactive as possible, because we know we have about an hour and some change with you all, and we don't want to stand the way between you and the fun reception that I keep hearing about later on today. But my name is Amalia Chamorro. I'm the Director of Education Policy for UnidosUS. We are the largest Latino civil rights organization in the nation. We are headquartered in DC, but we have staff and a network of community-based partners all over the US, and including in Puerto Rico and some of the districts. So just a little bit background about myself, and then I'll have my colleague introduce herself. So I am an immigrant from Peru. My family came to California when I was about 10 years old. I did not speak the language. My parents, thankfully, spoke a little bit of English, and they had been college professors in Peru. But when they came to the US, they didn't even have a teacher's credential. And so they really had to start again in order to be able to join the teaching profession, which they eventually did. So I'm the proud daughter of two public education bilingual teachers who are now retired. But that's why education was always such an integral part of my growing up. And I just remember having so many dinner conversations about, my parents' experiences as teachers, their migrant students, some of the internal battles that they had to face with the administration and leadership at their schools, and that always just stuck with me. So I've been a public policy professional for about 17, 18 years now. Have not always focused on education, but education is certainly what I am very passionate about. And so the work that I do from Washington, D.C. is really to help push for federal policies, but also to push for some state policies at some of our priority states like Arizona, California, Texas, and Florida, who have large populations of Latino students, to make sure that we are doing everything we can to make sure that the next generation of students and this generation of students have all the opportunities they have to succeed. So with that, I'll have my colleague introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Zamudio. I am the Vice President of Education at UnidosUS, and what we do on the education program side is work through the K through 16 continuum, working with families, working with students and educators, and supporting with our affiliate network across the country. So we have an affiliate network that's just under 300 affiliates across the country. So we're helping provide curricula, implement strategies, collecting data, helping provide subgrants to some of our affiliates as well. And Just a little background about myself. I come from the education space as a counselor. I was a counselor for 14 years. I was a high school counselor working primarily with first-generation low-income students in Los Angeles, many newcomers. So I understand the plight of many of our newcomer families, especially immigrant parents who all they know is that their child has to go to college. That's what many of us are tasked with. That's what I was tasked with. I'm a daughter of 2 Mexican immigrants, and I was tasked with, you don't have to work, but you have to go to school, and you have to go to college and figure it out. And I said, okay, I don't know what that means, but I'm gonna have to figure it out. And that's eventually why I became a counselor myself, because I didn't have anyone help me navigate that process. And looking back on it now, I could have done so many things. I could have gone to a great Ivy League school, I could have had tons of scholarships, but I didn't have anyone helping me along the way, and instead incurred a severe amount of student loan debt because I went to a private university and didn't apply for FAFSA the way that I should have, and learned all those really hard, difficult lessons that I don't want for our future generations. And that's why I became a counselor, and why I am so passionate about the work that we do at Unidos now, helping empower the next generation and working with students and families to empower our community. And so today we're going to share a bit about our newest policy brief that we published in July on Latino student success. And I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague. Oh, and we also want to make this interactive.
Yeah.
So we won't save the questions to the end. We want it to be interactive throughout. So if something comes up, please just ask your question. We want to engage and keep this conversational as much as possible.
Yep, so even if it's not a question and you have an observation or a comment, whoever's brave enough to go to the mics, and you can, chime in like throughout the presentation, because we just don't want to talk to you, at you for the next hour. So whoever's brave enough, we have a hard copy of the report that we'll be going through. But just to give you a little bit of background about the report, Advancing U.S. Educational Progress for All, that we released in July at our annual conference in San Antonio, we really felt like that was a time to not only focus on what was happening during the pandemic for students of color, including Latino students, but also look back at some of the progress that had been made over the last 30 years. So the report not only focuses on the impact of the pandemic, but also takes a look back at some of the gains that we have made in closing some of the opportunity gaps, and where some of the work that parents and students and communities had done along the way. And then we also conclude with a set of policy recommendations that policymakers at all levels, federal, state, or local, can take to make sure that we support our students in pandemic recovery. So this is just a little bit of an overview and agenda of how we're going to break down today's session. Just in terms of where we come from an equity lens, making sure that, the work that we are doing are closing those gaps that we know continue to exist and persist for far too many of our students. Also share with you some of the demographics and data about who are this generation's Latino students, and the diversity that actually exists in the Latino community. Again, we'll also go over some of the progress that had been made prior to the pandemic, and also share with you some of the aspirations that students and families have shared with us from the community about their dreams and hopes for the future. We'll also, of course, go over the many impacts that the pandemic has had on our Latino students. Also focus on the digital divide, also known as the homework gap, because we know that really hit a lot of families hard who didn't have access to high-speed internet or devices. And then we're also going to talk about the critical need for equitable funding to make sure that the schools where we know our students of color, our low-income students are attending, have as many resources as the wealthier school, even within the same school district. And also the need for diversity in the educator workforce, because we know how important it is for students to see themselves reflected in their teachers, in their counselors, and their school leadership, right? To be able to relate to see someone else who has gone through the education system and has become a professional in the education setting. That's really important. There's a lot of data that supports not only how important that is, but that it actually helps to improve academic outcomes for students. And then we'll also go over just a set of recommendations that I mentioned in terms of what can we actually do with this data and this information that we have to share with you, and a call to action for policymakers across the board to really meet the moment, that there is urgency as we continue to learn about just the depth of the consequences that students are experiencing because of the last 2.5 years of the disruptions to their education because of the pandemic. So with that, again, we invite you to engage with us, interact with us throughout the session. You can raise your hand and come to the mic, and we'll be sure to have a conversation with you all. So with that, again, UnidosUS is a Latino civil rights organization. We're a little bit over 50 years old now, and we used to be known as the National Council of La Raza. We actually started in Arizona as the Southwest Council of La Raza, and we have grown to become a national organization, and we really felt that it was time to not necessarily just rebrand, but really take a real hard look at our population and who we were, and really work to expand the tent and really shape the narrative of who Latinos were, which is how we came up with our new name, which is UnidosUS, and that has been our name since about 2015. But we believe that every child, no matter where they come from, their immigration background, their zip code, their life experiences, their income levels, should have every opportunity to have a successful education experience and graduate ready for college or career, whichever pathway that they choose, and that we need to acknowledge the barriers that exist in the education system and get those out of the way so that students can do what they need to do to be able to succeed. All right. So what is educational equity for us? I really think like the term equity has just become one of those terms that everybody talks about, and is suddenly, like the term du jour. Everybody's like using it, coining it, but what does it actually mean? And for us, students have always been at the center of everything that we do. Adults make a lot of decisions that impact students, and we need to make sure that, as I said, that we are closing the gaps that exist, but that we are doing so in a very intentional and targeted way, because we want to make sure that students with the least resources, the least support, have whatever they need to be able to have as much opportunity as their peers. So just to share with you more a little bit about who are today's students. So we have seen a tremendous growth in the population of the Latino student population, even in the last decade. So in 2009, about 22%, so about 1 in 5 students in the K-12 public school setting were Latino. Today, that has grown to 28%. And in just a few years, we're going to be almost a third of the student population. So it is a student population that is growing, and really reflects why it's so important to invest in Latino students, because it really impacts our overall student population.
And in some states, for instance, in California, 45% of the student population are Latino, and in New Mexico, it's 48%. So this is just the national average, but in certain states, the percentages are much higher of Latino enrollment.
That's right. And we also want to underscore, right, even though like Elizabeth's and my family, we come from immigrant backgrounds, and many Latinos in the US today are immigrants. Most Latinos, and over 94% of Latinos under the age of 18 were actually born right here in the United States of America. And that is really important to highlight, because there's always this perception, right, that the majority of Latinos are immigrants, and we just crossed the border, and like, no, we've been here. A lot of our community is born here, raised here. This is, for many of them, the only home that they've ever known. And so that's something that we always feel like the need to highlight. And also, there's a huge diversity in younger Latinos. 22% of Latinx millennials identify as LGBTQIA. That's 1/5 of the younger generation of Latinos who are identifying in their identity. And then we also have 3 million in our population who identify as Black Latinos or Afro-Latinx. There's various terms that we use, but it's about 20 to 25% of Latinos actually identify as Afro-Latinos, and I think that's very significant, especially when we know that not only do we need to have solidarity between the Black and Latino communities, but also we're part of the same community in many, many instances. So let's just share with you a little bit about demographics.
Numbers for the United States as a whole?
Yes, so these are national numbers, but we also have in our report some numbers that can be broken down by state. So for example, I'll be sharing also about some of the statistics around English learners, the majority of who are Latino, but not all of them are Latino. And you can see in North Carolina, for example, which is where we are, 8% of the student population are English learners. The national average is about 10%, so North Carolina is actually right about there with the national average. And in states like California, it's actually higher, like 20%. Thank you. You have a question?
I've got a question about the 3 million
Okay.
figure
Yes.
on Afro-Latinos.
Yes.
So is that based upon self-classification in the census?
Yes, these are census numbers.
Okay, so one of the serious problems is Latinos tend to self-report their race as white regardless of how they look.
Yes.
So
Yes, and so
depending on how you think of who is Afro-Latino, that's probably an underestimate.
Oh, yeah.
oh yes, we definitely know that, and one of the things that Unidos also pushes for is better data transparency, so that we actually have more accurate count and opportunities of how people also choose to identify. And I mean, that goes back like years historical in terms of like not even having the option for Hispanic or Latino on the census many years ago.
Unidos, back then NCLR, was the organization who was pushing the U.S. Census Bureau to include Hispanic on the census, which had not been included back in the 80s. And now we continue that advocacy with the transparency, with pushing on, with our communities around awareness. We know that in the last census that there was a lot of speculation and hesitancy with completing the census because of the rhetoric that was out there. And so we're working with our communities and our affiliates to raise awareness about the criticality and the importance of census data and how it triggers so many different access to resources and information, and for us to be able to share information like today. We know that I wish I could put an asterisk on this whole slide.
Yeah.
Because it is U.S. Census data, but it is the most accurate data that we have available to us at the moment.
That's right. All right, so this is just a little bit of more data demographics around English learners. And so these are students for whom they have a home language that is different than English at home. As I shared, I myself I still consider myself a lifelong English learner. But we're also, it's not just about the data and the growing population of English learners, but also about changing the narrative. Because for like far too long, English learners have been seen as, because they don't speak English yet or are still learning to speak the language, that is considered a deficit. When really being able to speak in more than one language, being multilingual, should be considered an asset. And I mean, that's what we hear from the business community, right? I mean, this is a global economy. The fact that a student already has strength in one language and is learning another language should be celebrated and should be encouraged and supported. And it's really telling, when you see some programs that may be dual language, right, of English speakers, wanting to learn French or Mandarin or Spanish or another language, and that's encouraged and supported. But when it comes to Spanish speakers or other foreign speakers learning English, that is somehow seen as a deficit. So there's a lot of work to be done to really change that narrative. And I'll also say that, yes, while most English learners or multilingual learners, as we prefer to refer to them, although technically in the federal law it's still English learners, while most of them do speak Spanish at home and the majority of them are Latinos, the EL demographic population is diverse. We have English learners from many countries around the world speaking hundreds of languages. And so that's also just important to uphold that this isn't just a Latino issue, but it's also an issue that we work alongside many of our partners to advocate for together.
And I'm sorry, I think you had a question on the last slide?
This one?
The previous slide.
Oh, this one?
94%, there's 6% who aren't US born. And I don't know, sometimes I hear about tendency of that becomes a group that's marginalized more than, those who have been traditionally or here much longer but just have the language that continue them. United States was mostly it belongs to the Spanish anyway, so at least around Texas that happens. So I'm just trying to understand that what do you do or how are they incorporated? Because I just see, when you're marginalized, it's just not good, no matter if you're black or whatever.
That's right. Yes, and we have immigrant students coming from all over the world, right? Not just Latin American countries. And so Unidos, we don't just focus on one issue because we know that there's intersectional issues that impact the family. So we also work to advocate on immigration policies, right? And then the education system also for supports and resources for newcomer and immigrant students, refugee students, because we know that they are often the most underserved and marginalized students, and we want to make sure that we are putting a spotlight on the students who have the least resources and who may be facing discrimination too because of their status. We also have many students that, yes, while the majority of Latino children are US born, there's about 6 million children in the US that come from mixed status families, meaning one of their parents may be a US citizen, but their other parent may be undocumented. And there's a lot of barriers that comes with that too, because sometimes that prevents the whole family from being able to access some of the social services that are only available to if the whole family has documented status.
And the social emotional strain on the family that comes with having uncertainty around documentation status in the home. And we know there's an extreme amount of data around the stressors and the trauma for children and families living in this uncertainty, especially when we see ICE roadblocks on the road or surprise visits. Many children are traumatized and are afraid to ask for support and seek resources because they're unsure of what may come if they were to share with someone about their mixed status situation.
That's right. Great comment. All right, so okay, so this slide refers to some of the academic progress that Latino students had made over the last few years, and then I'll also share a slide with the results that just came out this week from the federal government. But the National Assessment of Educational Progress is also called the Nation's Report Card. This is really a federal marker that happens annually, although this was paused during the pandemic. So the most recent years that we had data for was 2019 until the 2022 results just came out on Monday. But this it's a way that the federal government since 1990 has been able to track how students in 4th grade and in 8th grade are doing in math and reading and other subjects. So, but for today's purposes, we'll just focus on math and reading. But this just goes to show you some of the progress that Latino students had made from 1990, which is when the assessment, the test began to be conducted across the US, and to 2019, right before the pandemic. So we saw that Latino students in 4th grade math in 1990 scored 200, I believe it's out of 500. And then in 2019, right, we had made some progress, a little bit closer to 250, which is the halfway mark. But there had been some progress that had been made. And then again, this test was paused in 2020 and 2021. So now we just have the latest results, which I'll share with you in just a bit. We had also seen record numbers of high school graduation for Latino students. This is something that UnidosUS and many of our partners really focused on over many years to increase the number of students who graduated high school, because we know that many jobs require at least a high school degree, so it's really a pathway to upward mobility to have that high school diploma. And so in about a span of 8 years, we saw the high school graduation number go from 71% to 82%, which was a record high. And again, this was before the pandemic. And we saw just a historical, really growth and really explosion of Latino students going on to post-secondary education. And you can see the numbers there and the growth from 1990 to 2019, just, so many more of our students and peers enrolling in colleges and universities. And so, and I really want to say that, this progress was really due to the work of students, parents, families themselves, right? The community that supported them to do the hard work, to be able to improve their scores, to be able to complete high school, and to be able to pursue a post-secondary education, and also the work of advocates who have been working for many, many years, to be able to change those policies and remove those barriers that get in the way. So I'm just going to share. So these are some of the numbers and some of the headlines that you may have seen this week. There's been a lot of news stories about the crisis that the education system is in, and just the depth of the impact of the pandemic on learning over the last 3 years. So one of the big headlines we've seen, and this is across the board for all students, not just Latino students, but especially in math, is where we've seen the biggest declines, and it's no exception for Latino students. And so we saw the largest decline since NAEP actually started in 1990 with the 2022 scores. And these are just some of the numbers I pulled from the NAEP data that was released just this week. But we did see, again, math scores for Latino students drop 7 points from 3 years ago, from where Latino students were in 2019. And again, we saw a decline for all student groups, but particularly for Hispanic and Black students, the numbers are very much similar, and the trend is very much in decline. Also, in terms of English learners were already experiencing among the widest gaps in comparison to their peers before the pandemic. And of course, we have not seen too much improvement in that area. We also know that English learners don't necessarily receive the resources and support that they need in a targeted way to be able to improve on that. But we did see also a decline in their math scores as well compared to the national average. So you have only 4% of English learners actually scoring at proficiency, right? So this is just like the knowledge that you need to know, right, to be able to advance just being proficient. And compared to 26%, which is the national average, I mean, you can see that English learners really have among the lowest proficiency levels, unfortunately. And then we saw, again, a decline in reading as well. So while we saw the biggest drops in math, we also have to pay attention to what's happening at reading levels as well. So I'll just stop there, because I know it's a lot of numbers and percentages to throw at you and let you absorb that a little bit, but I will be passing it on to my colleague Elizabeth, who will share a little bit more about what we've been hearing and experiencing with our parents and families in our network.
All right. So here's a snapshot, one of our favorite photos of our families. And we hear from our families all the time, just as my experience was from my family, you're tasked to go to college. Many of our Latino families also have high aspirations for their children and their families. We have selected quotes here where different individuals are saying they want to join the military, they want to go on to college and major in business or something in social justice, become a human rights lawyer or attorney. So there is really high hope. This is something that we see over and over again amongst the Latino community around achieving the dream, the American dream, equates to homeownership, equates to post-secondary education. That's what we see time and time again when we hear directly from our families. And we see here that 87% of Latinos believe that college is essential. It is a non-negotiable for a majority of homes. And 58% of our families agree that family engagement is essential with the school communities. And this is something that we have been championing for years, and we hear directly from our school partners, we hear directly from educators that without family interaction, family engagement, that is the key to student success. But many times schools are not implementing that family engagement component. And so this is one of the areas that we're trying to work with and help combat especially through the pandemic, where we saw that family engagement was key. When we're working from home, we're learning from home. Many times Latino families who were considered frontline workers weren't able to stay home with their children. And their children stayed at home, Latino children stayed at home and had to figure out schooling and technology on their own. And we saw some of the challenges there, and we are seeing it now in these NAEP results, where we see a drop in some student data. So the schools, we are really charging the schools to have a stronger commitment on family engagement with their families. Here's just some more statistics around the impacts of the pandemic. And here, the 70% of Latino parents reported that their children experienced challenges during the pandemic. So of course, students had a difficult time engaging online, virtually. I know even with my own 2 children, I was constantly on them. Do you have your camera on? Because as an educator on the other side, I could only imagine how challenging that would be to teach to a classroom of blank Zoom screens, right? But not just that, engaging with the curriculum and the material and engaging with your classmates was also very challenging. And we also saw that parents were very concerned. 42% of parents were very concerned about what their children were learning, what the outcomes would be. And according to the Pew Research Center, we see that 28% of students were concerned or very concerned about the outcomes of the pandemic or the effects of the pandemic. And 42% of families were concerned, with 22% extremely concerned about what that would look like for their children. And we see the disparity between Latino families and Latino students with non-Hispanic white students just below that. So whereas 42% of our Latino families were extremely concerned about the impacts of the pandemic, 25% of non-Hispanic white families were concerned. And so that speaks to the access to resources, the access to information. Many families, although schools were sending out information, it may not have been accessible to families. It may not have been in a culturally responsive form of communication. Families were not able to digest the information or share it with their students. Or many times we see amongst our Latino communities that our students are the translators for their families. And so sometimes that message may not be translated accurately, especially if a student isn't doing well in school. And that message to translate to their caregiver is, I'm failing a class. That may not translate from the student. We have a quote down here at the bottom from one of our family members who participated in our ed tech program. We have a program for families where we equip them with the knowledge and skills to be able to access technology. When we were hit with the global shutdown, the national shutdown, schools were giving students resources such as laptops and mobile internet devices, but many families didn't know how to use them. And so we found that we needed to create accessible language for families. When we would say Wi-Fi, families didn't know what that meant. They said, what is Wi-Fi? And finally, one parent told us, oh, you mean Wi-Fi? I was like, oh, Wi-Fi, okay. Yes, Wi-Fi. But see, a nuance like that we wouldn't have known had we not been engaging directly with the families, which the schools were not doing. The direct service providers were doing that. And so here, just to show you the resilience of our families, we had a parent who stated, we have two options, adapting and adapting. Those are the only options. As you saw on the previous slide, 87% of families are extremely engaged with their students' pursuits of post-secondary education. And there is this commitment to continue academically, but if they don't have the access or the tools or resources, then we're already at a disadvantage. And then, speaking of educators, the likelihood that teachers have ELs in their classroom who are behind academically, and as we saw in the NAEP report, we see that EL students are really struggling now. You'll see that as students progress through the K through 12 system, the likelihood increases on how much further behind they are academically, with the most disproportionate being in middle school. In those critical years when students are most impressionable, when they're making those decisions on where they're going to maneuver. Am I going to pursue the college pathway, or am I going to pursue another option? So this is something that we really have our eyes on, that we're very in tune with, and something that we are anxious to see in the new results, to see how we can further engage our educators on the EL front. And then, so all that progress that we were making between 1990 to 2019, I know many of educators in the room are familiar with the summer slide, so that dip in academic retention information after each academic year. Here we're seeing the pandemic slide. And we're seeing some drops in enrollment, on graduation rates. So in the blue box here, just in 2021, we don't even have the most recent 2022 data yet, but according to the Department of Education, we saw just under 1% decline in high school graduation rates. We do expect that to increase in the 2022 data. And then in college enrollment data, we saw a 4% decrease. And this is significant, as we've seen, we were making such great headway. We were at 3.8 million Latino students enrolling in post-secondary education in 2019. And 3.8 million, 4% of 3.8 million is pretty significant. And that is also expected to increase. And not only just the freshman college enrollment, but the persistence of currently enrolled college students. So we're seeing a lot of effort being placed on students who have now come through the pandemic, either second or third year students who are coming through the pandemic in post-secondary, but are no longer able, because there's just so much. There's so much trauma, there's so much weight, there's so many other stressors that students are undergoing, in addition to the academic stressors and being the first in your family to go to college and the whole nuance that comes with being a first-generation student. But now adding this additional layer and additional layers from the pandemic, we do expect to see continued decline in college enrollment amongst Latino students and college graduation amongst Latino students. All right. And then the homework gap. So we heard the digital divide. We heard from many of our partners that they were doing the best that they could to help with the digital divide. But we still found that 31% of our Latino households lacked access to high-speed broadband. Some families, I don't know if anyone's ever done your at-home speed test. Typically, those of us who have high-speed internet access, it ranges between 260 to 300 and some megabytes per second. Some of our families who believed that they had quality internet access had 4 megabytes per second. Imagine 2-3 students at the home trying to Zoom at the same time. Impossible, right? And then if you had a parent at home trying to also work from home, it was not manageable. So that was a big barrier for a lot of students, and I can imagine many students just gave up altogether. And that's one of the reasons why we saw this academic decline as well. And then also both of these first two numbers, the 31%, the 17%, this was a study that we engaged in with some partners called, was it All for Education?
Yep.
All for Education Initiative.
That goes by All for Ed.
All for Ed.
It's more shortened their term. National Urban League, also in the National Indian Education Association.
Yeah, and this study was conducted right at the peak of the pandemic in 2020, right at the start, when things were really nerve-wracking, to say it lightly. But we were able to see that of those that were surveyed, 17% of the Latino households did not have computers. Most of our students were working off of mobile devices, off of cell phones, trying to do homework off of cell phones. Parents were trying to access resources from the school off of their cell phones with limited broadband, unlimited data on their phones. So it was very challenging for students to engage and learn. And we began developing our parent education, our ed tech curricula. And in this program, we were teaching families how to access digital literacy skills. So explaining what a Wi-Fi was, explaining how to use the computer, how to create an email. Many families didn't even have an email, and this was the primary form of communication for most schools to our families. So creating an email was essential for our families. And then how to check their email. So it wasn't just that first step of creating the email, but then also how to check it and regularly checking it to ensure that they weren't falling behind. And then also many of our schools transition to online learning management systems. So then training and teaching our families how to access those LMSs, which were not translated. They were not accessible to our families. So how do I know what my student's grade is? How do I know that my student did their homework? How do I know what their homework is? How do I support them? So helping them access that information. But you see here, 50% of our parents reported having difficulty understanding their child's material, their students' materials for school. And then also 58% had trouble communicating with the teachers and educators because, again, lack of email access, lack of the language barrier, lack of accessibility. So something that we, again, are championing with not only our affiliates across the country, but also on the Hill and with administrators to provide more equitable access. All right, and I'm going to turn it over to Amalia.
Do you have a question?
Oh,
Go
yep.
for it.
I'm interested, let's see if this works.
I'm interested in school choice because so far the statistics you showed were about public schools, and then now you're talking about connection to teachers, and your own background seems to be from public schools. It turns out that, I don't know what the statistics are about Latino participation in charter schools and other expressions of school choice. Florida is ahead of other states in terms of allowing all kinds of competition among the parents for the schools where they send their kids, and it's also the state that has perhaps the most active Hispanic population and with a lot of Cubans who tend to have higher income than Mexicans and who might have played a role. I don't know about that. I'm not an expert on this topic, but I want to ask that question. And I also wonder whether the need for interventions in communicating between parents and teachers, whether that depends on whether it's a private school like a Catholic school or a public school, because the teachers have demonstrated a lack of understanding of parents' problems in the last couple of years, 2.5 years with COVID. There's been an enormous amount of dissatisfaction among parents of children going to public schools. My own son pulled his children out of public school, put them in a private school. And so, you know, that has to be addressed. I mean, it's very nice what you're doing, but you know, what is already being done in terms of parents choosing a school where the school is more responsive to their children?
Great question, and there's a lot to unpack there. So I'll take a stab at it and then invite my colleague to also chime in. But when we talk about public schools, we also include public charter schools, because I think there's a perception too that all charter schools are private and not part of the public school system. And we actually, as part of our affiliate network, which are community-based and community organizations, we also have public charter school networks that are part of the Unidos affiliate network. So we have formal partnerships with public charter schools in different states, and we also work with them to implement some of our programs and partnerships and advocacy and pilot some of those innovative ideas coming out of those schools. And we actually just partnered with the National Alliance for Public Charter Schools. We just published a blog, I believe it was last Friday, that contains some of the most recent data on Latinos in public charter schools. Because during the pandemic, public charter schools across the U.S. did see a growth in Latinos, in overall student enrollment, but particularly in the Latino population. And they actually saw the largest growth for Latino students during the last 2-3 years. And then they also shared data with us that actually shows that, talking about teacher diversity, which you see here, you know, there's a mismatch, right? And the number and percentage of K-12 students who are Latino in traditional public schools versus only 9% of teachers in those schools who are Latinos, and that's where the largest gap exists, right? Students are not seeing themselves as reflected in their instructors and their counselors and whatnot. But in public charter schools, the most recent data shows that it's actually higher than 9%. It's about 16% of teachers in public charter schools who are Latino. So we're actually seeing more diverse numbers of the teaching profession in public charter schools. So I have a slide later on which shows our education blog, where you can check out that story and the latest data. But it's something that I found to be really interesting in terms of the growth of the Latino population and some of the data that we're seeing in public charter schools. Was there a question back there? Yes, and here.
I applaud the work you're doing, and I appreciate it, but when you're doing the analysis about people graduating and going on to college, are you factoring in what I'll call restrictive states? I went on the computer just to see, but North Carolina is a place where undocumented immigrants and I think even DACA recipients cannot pay in-state tuition. So this is the only place they know, but they cannot pay in-state tuition to go to one of the 16 campuses, and then the community college mirrored it, because another way to decrease the cost would have been to go to community college and then to the 4-year. Are you factoring that into your analysis?
Yes, so that's definitely something that we work on with our immigration team, because we do see, unfortunately the Federal Dream Act never was enacted. It moved along through Congress. There were times when it looked like it was going to pass. And so that's why we have this patchwork of different state policies where some states provide for in-state tuition. And that's just for students who are undocumented to be able to pay the same rate as everybody else to be able to go to that school. It's not asking for any special rate or any special treatment, because otherwise they have to pay international student fees, which are much higher, and many of them cannot afford that, or they have to go to another state that actually may provide more financial aid or resources, but where they still have to pay out-of-state tuition. So that really is a barrier for many of our undocumented students to just, even if they have the grades and the qualifications and the drive to be able to pursue that post-secondary education, in many instances they're held back because they just cannot, because they don't have that opportunity afforded to them. And not only do they lose out on that education and opportunity, we're all losing out on their talents and what they can contribute, with their degrees and with their studies. So that's something that we continue to work towards, both at the national level, but also at the state level. And we have affiliates in most states, including here in North Carolina, too, who are working on just that campaign. Thank you. Yes.
I wonder, how does that impact students' ability in North Carolina to access college and career promise, where they can be dually enrolled as high school students and working on college credit as well? And I don't know if you have expertise on that. Is that a workaround for our students that we can, in North Carolina?
It is a start of a workaround. So there are places like Josephine Dodge Clemens Early College High School, where at the end of high school, they could be done with the first 2 years of college, and it's housed on the campus of North Carolina Central University. So that's a possible workaround.
Well, all students, high school students in North Carolina can attend community colleges paid for, right? So as dually enrolled students.
But the out-of-state rate is the barrier that she's talking about.
No, I guess what I'm asking is, so if I'm a student at a traditional high school in North Carolina, the state of North Carolina is going to pay for you to be dually enrolled and attend classes at the community college. And so I guess my question is, does that apply to our students who are undocumented as well? Is that a workaround for them?
According to Roy Cooper, when he was the Attorney General, no. And Josh Stein has not changed. It went into effect in 2004, and it's not changed.
Okay, so I guess my question is, how is it different from the early college, if at middle college, and if I have students at any of the schools who are doing that, because they go through the high school to do that. You have a college advisor from that community college at the high school who works with them through that process. But
That's, I think, the workaround, but there's a point where it stops. I agree.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would just add to that, because Unidos, we're also working on, pushing for more investments in dual enrollment so that more high school students can attain college credit while they're in high school. But at the same time, I think to your point too, that may work to some extent for undocumented students, but at the same time, they can only accrue so many credits while they're in high school, not enough to actually be able to earn a full certificate or a full 4-year degree. But I know we're coming up on time, and we just have a couple of minutes. Oh, but go ahead. And we're just gonna wrap up soon. Yes, go ahead.
So, listening to what you've done, I think one of the problems or one of the things that we are seeing is most of the issues that's going on are things that even happened before the pandemic. There are things that existed. So the pandemic only, brought these things to
And
light,
exposed.
right?
Yep.
So then with your research, I think even though your focus was more on the pandemic, I don't know whether you've looked at these things that existed before the pandemic. Because really, sometimes when we talk, we always talk about the pandemic. But I feel like the pandemic only opened our eyes to things that really did exist, but we never took note of.
Yep. No, you're absolutely right. So even though we do share some of the progress that Latino students had made over the last years, we still saw far too many wide achievement gaps across the board, right? So those are we just wanted to share some examples to say, like, yes, there had been some progress, but still a lot of work that had to be done. And the pandemic only made those situations worse and exposed them, like you said, to everybody's side. So, I mean, this is why this is an opportunity, right, not to go back to the way things were before, because that really wasn't working for our students. And so we really need to make sure that we are using this time to actually transform the education system to what we need it to be to work for our students. Because even though, you know, some folks may want to go back to normal or, you know, want to go back to like, we cannot afford to go back to the status quo. I mean, that was a broken system. And so we really need to make sure that we actually take some of the lessons learned during the pandemic to really make a lot of these systemic changes for the long term.
Hello. One question. I am Noelia Paez. I want to say thank you for all the work you are doing. I think it's wonderful that you are supporting our children. So our stories may be a bit similar. I am Peruvian. And
I'm Peruvian.
Yes.
Yeah, okay, we'll talk after.
And I brought my kids here when they were 2 years old. I have twins. So it was interesting. I saw them, you know, growing up here. At the time in Texas, we had access to bilingual programs. So they were English language learners for a few years, and we had access to these wonderful, you know, bilingual dual language programs where kids have content they study in English and Spanish during the whole day. So it was wonderful. So my point is we need that kind of support for our children. I know those programs could be very expensive because you need more resources in the classroom and teachers, you know, that are bilingual as well. So, but the children grow up feeling special, like speaking Spanish is something good, that it could be like an strength instead of a weakness. Mm-hmm. Because for many years, the category was known as limited English proficient before they were categorized as English language learners. So that had a very negative connotation, and that was very bad for the children, to the point that some parents didn't want access to the services because they didn't want to be labeled as Hispanics. When I moved from Texas to New Mexico, there was no bilingual program anymore. So my kids now, they couldn't feel like Spanish was special at all because kids were pulled out of classrooms just for a couple of hours a week to, you know, to have instruction in English. And now they feel like they are the different kids from the school, so they don't want access anymore. And then even though they grew up speaking English and Spanish, my daughters, now 19, they don't feel any special about the Spanish, which is really sad because it is special. It is a strength. So they could get, you know, credits in college for, you know, taking a proficient Spanish test, and they could get credit. They are not pursuing that. So, and I feel bad, and I wonder how kids in, you know, less privileged families feel about this. So we need to focus on little children and making them, you know, open the eyes to see that this is something special. Like being able to speak 2 languages is good, that it means a lot, it's going to mean a lot in the labor market too. So we need to support our children in that way. I feel like we don't do enough for them. Yeah. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, no, we are there with you just in terms of, you know, being able to speak more than one language. It's a strength, it's an asset, and that's not just, you know, a policy making, changing thing. That also, you know, has to have a narrative change, right? And come from, you know, how language is seen and perceived by communities, because many parents, right, from previous generations were told, you know, don't speak to your children in Spanish, don't speak to your children, you know, speak to them only in English. And we still have some laws on the books in states like Arizona, for example, that are very much limited in that way. So it's, you know, it's really going to take all of us to make sure that we are holding up languages as an asset. But with that, I do want to thank you all for sticking around. I'm just going to show you a couple slides that has our contact information and where you can find some of our resources. And I would invite you that if you went to the mic or raised your hand and asked a question, I have some hard copies of our report that I'll hand out on a first come basis for those folks that were brave enough to share your thoughts. But just want to share this slide with you, and I don't know if Duke will make this available to everybody, but our website, you can find all of our publications and resources, UnidosUS.org. You can find the full report on that link if this is going to be something that's going to be shared, but you can also find it on our website. We also, in July, released a new fact sheet on Latino trends in higher education. And then we are about to release, I just did a webinar yesterday with some preliminary findings of a national survey of Latino parents and caregivers with children 0 to 5 years old. That's really eye-opening and has a lot of really critical data. And then if you would love to check out, I think the lady that asked the question about school choice and charters left, but we have a multimedia education blog that's integrated with our website. It's called Progress Report. So you can also access that through our main website, and we have a lot of resources and articles there. And then we already had questions throughout. Oh, which one? This one? Oh, okay. Yes. And then we'll put out our contact information. Feel free to reach out to us at any time. We'll also, I think, gonna check out the reception later on. So if you're there, feel free to come up to us and mix with us. But again, I just want to thank everybody for your engagement and your interest on this topic today. And thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. Thank you.